I would like to thank the University of Southern California for inviting me here. It is an amazing pleasure to be in Armenia, as it always is. It is indeed a place where you can palpably feel the past in the earth, in the air, in the food, in the wine, and it always does strange things to one's head, for some people. But it is an amazing privilege, pleasure to be here. I'd like to start with the end of transition, the name of our conference, and I'd like to talk about Russia in that context for a few moments before getting into Russia's policy in the region. Now, we've spoken a lot about transition, what that means, and I think to add to what a lot of speakers have said, in the case of Russia, when we look at it as transitioning, we tend to think transition from point A to point B, from yesterday to tomorrow, from tyranny to freedom, essentially from two things. It's a binary issue. And that in itself, that view, has kind of embedded with it a certain path dependency, even if we don't think about it. In other words, we tend to see, we're talking about transition, we tend to have a sort of preconception of where exactly it is we're supposed to be transitioning to, and I'm talking about Russia. So I think in reality, what has been happening under Vladimir Putin is that whole idea of binary transition has been kind of upturned. If the idea was to transition from democracy to freedom, that obviously hasn't happened. What exactly has it transitioned to? Well, we don't know. We can say hybrid democracy, facade democracy, all of these are good things. But generally speaking, I think that we should be speaking not about the end of transition, not about the sense of Russia having stopped moving. We should, I think, get away from the idea of this, again, path-dependent model, that there is a clear-cut end to where all of this is going, and just accept that we're not quite sure where Russia is headed at this point. It could be headed in many different directions. Now, that said, I would like to talk about what Russia is currently doing, in effect, to itself and to the areas around it. And paradoxically, that is, in some ways, that does chime with an end to transition, an end of movement. In the South Caucasus, as in the rest of the post-Soviet space, Russia has de facto imposed a certain volatile status quo, as complicated as that sounds, maybe as paradoxical as that sounds. We're talking here essentially of freezing, whether by maintaining frozen conflicts or sustaining various forms of frozenness. The point here is that frozenness, a certain corridor between a thaw and a deep freeze, limits the movement of actors out of their free volition. And if we look at what Russia has been doing in the last several years, whether in Ukraine or in Georgia or with Armenia or with the Eurasian Economic Union, that tends to follow that pattern. Russia, and I like to say Russia, not Putin, because it's complicated. Let's not personalize things here. I don't see it as a monolith. Russia tends to feel more comfortable with a certain level of conservatism, with a certain limitation in the way that actors in its immediate sphere of influence move. Because every time actors move towards the West, that creates evident and, I think, pretty obvious anxiety for Russia. So, in that sense, we're going to talk about, I'll bring up several frozen conflicts. In that sense, frozenness, whether locally or as an abstract concept, seems to be suiting Russia at that point, and I'd like to get into the reasons why. I'll start with what's the actual events that have been happening to bring us here. Now, Russia lost Georgia in 2004, Following the war in South Ossetia, it maintained a certain frozenness with the unrecognized status of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And then Ukraine, and much like in Ukraine, contrary to expectations that Russia would seek to annex Donbass, over the years it became clear that the main objective was to maintain a frozen conflict there. Now I'll return to that point for a moment, because initially Russia annexed Crimea, and everybody thought that, well, if it did that, then that's exactly what it plans to do in East Ukraine. And that wasn't really the case. I think that in the beginning, Russia had a lot of objectives, a lot of possibilities about what to do with Donbass. And ultimately, what seemed to suit it best, most of all, was this frozen conflict. And in some ways, this is also the case with Nagorno-Karabakh. Russia arms both sides of the conflict, providing up to 85% of Azerbaijan's weapons. When the conflict flares up, as it did in spring 2016, Russia intervenes, with Putin personally brokering something of a ceasefire, which in reality wasn't a ceasefire at all. Now, as such, it's kind of becoming almost as though Russia wants these conflicts to be there. It almost benefits from these conflicts, from maintaining that certain corridor of frozenness, not too cold, not too hot. But why? What does Russia get out of these potentially explosive situations? The key word here, I think, is potentiality. If we look at what precipitated, what was motivating Russia, at least some of the factors that were motivating it to act the way it did, one of them was the Eurasian Economic Union. And as in Ukraine, as with Ukraine, Russia sought to pressure Armenia to join the Union, in which case it did. The methods that it used to pressure, much as with Ukraine, was cheap gas, but with Armenia also the possibility of increased weapons sales to Azerbaijan. So Russia conveniently hinted a few months before Armenia decided to join the Eurasian Economic Union. It hinted at increased arms sales to Azerbaijan, thereby essentially creating a situation that basically Armenia had no recourse to do otherwise. So, what is this? What is exactly that Russia wants in this? Is it domination? Is it the restoration of the Soviet Union? I think where the Eurasian Union is concerned, Russia pursues a strategy of multiple, sometimes conflicting objectives. And this is, I think it's very important to remember that we're talking about these multiple objectives. And this is, in fact, opportunism rather than strategy. For instance, in 2011, the picture of the Eurasian Economic Union was one of political and military, not just economic integration. I remember back then, Pavel Borodin, the Russian official who headed the project, told me he did see something akin to the restoration of the Soviet Union. In other words, not just economic integration, but political and possibly even military. In that sense, Russia saw itself as kind of restoring something to something like the European Union just in the East. But these plans did not materialize. Russia had Russia was considering other objectives, other possibilities. And this came to a head in 2014, particularly with the Ukrainian crisis. It became clear that political integration was not possible, and Russia was perfectly happy, and in fact it was aiming all along to essentially create an economic union. The Ukraine crisis played a major role in this because for actors like Kazakhstan and Belarus, it was after what had happened, they simply could not fathom that kind of economic and military cooperation given the unpredictability of Russia's actions. They did not want to be coerced. And I remember hearing in Kazakhstan in 2014 that a lot had changed in terms of their own readiness, their own, I guess, enthusiasm for this union. So, what we have at the end of that is Russia as an actor that takes what it can get. It's an opportunistic rather than a strategic creature. And it will do so with a mix of coercion and incentives. But if what we are seeking to get at is its motivations, then these are constantly in flux. It wants a strategy, hence it wants to limit movements westwards and forwards on the post-Soviet state. But in that corridor of frozenness, it will make do with opportunism. And I think in that sense, in closing, I'd like to say that getting back to the point of path dependency, if we assume something about Russia, if we assume that Russia wants to restore the Soviet Union, if that's what we believe it wants to do, we as Western policymakers, and we start treating it as such, in many ways that might become a self-fulfilling prophecy. In other words, we might be imposing upon Russia a certain situation that it will assume, okay, well, if that's what you expect and that's what we can get, that's what we're going to aim for. Is that what we want? I don't think so. I think in some ways, what happened with the Eurasian Economic Union was possibly a good thing, possibly better than the kind of union that Russia and Kazakhstan had originally envisaged. Now, for Armenia, what that means for Armenia is likewise a way to cautiously but pragmatically look at its options, not in this path-dependent model, not with the idea that, okay, we are dependent on Russia, not with that thinking that we have no choices, but with the possibility that maybe being in the Eurasian Economic Union is not such a good thing after all. Thinking about those things pragmatically, looking forward, I think that creates, the thinking itself creates opportunities, first and foremost for Armenia to get out of that bind, to get out of that path dependency. I think that's it for now. Again, it's a pleasure to be here, and I really look forward to hearing the next speakers. Thank you.